Everyone, thank you very much for coming this early to our panel, and welcome. The topic is infrastructure-driven growth model of MDBs within planetary limits. And this session we wanted to hold as a roundtable. As you can see, this isn't a very conducive format. But what it basically means is we will have a bit more interaction. We will just have short contributions from each of the speakers. No PowerPoints, so we'll be glad to hear. And then a conversation with the speakers and to the floor. My name is Jessica Rosine. I am Oxfam's lead on the Asian Development Bank, working closely together with the NGO Forum and members as well. And I'll do a round of introductions as well shortly. So the context for this topic is infrastructure driven growth. Infrastructure is a key theme and has been over the past few days and continues to be. And also with the emergence of new players, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we wanted to do this a bit differently this time and look at what it means for all banks together, not just the Asian Development Bank. We had hoped to have a speaker here from the AIIB, but weren't able to entice anyone. So the ADB does these sessions quite well with interactions with NGOs, and we hope that the AIIB will follow suit and that in the future we will also be able to have a conversation with them at the table. So then I'll just introduce all of us briefly, and then we'll start with three speakers, then we'll have a 10-minute questions and comments from the floor. Then go to the next three speakers, and then I'll do a question for all speakers, and then we'll open to the floor as well. So to my left is Knut Focking from Urgewand. Knut will be speaking about the harmonization of safeguard policies for all MDBs. You're right, Ryan Hassan from the Executive Director of the NGO Forum, and he will be talking about the AIIB's vision for growth, and in particular the One Belt, One Road. Then we are pleased to have Jan Willem van Blaake, the Alternative Executive Director for the Dutch government, to give his perspective on these topics. Mabe Buenaventura from Asian People's Movement for Development and Development will be speaking on climate, finance and infrastructure. Kate Geary, who is Oxfam's policy lead on land, will be looking at funding through infrastructure funds and the lessons learned for MDBs, the implications. And Stephanie Freed from Uluru Foundation will be speaking about the challenges of funding infrastructure through international financial intermediaries, particularly. So with that, I'll ask Ryan to start us off. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and thanks for everyone to be here. I won't take up too much time, but just do a few broad strokes on the context in which the NGO Forum on the ADB operates and how we perceive the changing trends in development finance. Well, the first thing that we're noticing is this constant rhetoric around infrastructure investment, which is going to come towards us. And I think to take a step back and look at this narrative a few years ago, I think it was the Brisbane G20 summit, where it was committed that G20 countries will increase their GDP growth rate by over 2% by 2020. And one of their main means to do this would be infrastructure investment globally. This message was carried through in the Financing for Development Summit in Addis Ababa, and I just recently attended the Financing for Development Asia Pacific discussions with a few of the Asian delegations from the governments, and it seemed that the UNSCAP, the ADB Institute was there. It was the same mantra being chanted that yes, there is a great need for infrastructure investment, which sums up to $8 trillion in Asia. But the funny thing is, we haven't heard our governments really screaming and shouting about the need for infrastructure development at that scale. So that's the dichotomy in which we are placed, that is this really something that we want, or is this something which is probably coming from above as an agenda? So keeping that in mind, just to lay the context down on where we operate, 750 million people live on $1.25 a day in Asia. inequality is rising, even though GDP growth has been pretty healthy in some Asian countries, but inequality has been rising by 20% in the last 20 years. And considering all that, we've crossed our carbon dioxide emissions. It has gone over the roof. It's at 400 million. And if you look at Asia recently, there were 6 earthquakes spanning across the entire equator in a span of 7 days. So if the Nepal earthquake is a classic example of how precarious the future of infrastructure investment might be. I don't want to scare off the private sector, probably in the room, who wants to invest in infrastructure, but but the state of the planet is very vulnerable. Saying that, from forum end, when we are looking at infrastructure projects, namely from the ADB, we've faced multiple vulnerabilities on the ground. First of all, displacement becomes a key issue every time you build large-scale infrastructure, and if that is not properly pre-understood and pre-reasoned with due diligence and the right amount of feedback from the ground, with the right voices being connected to the machinery of implementation of the project, there will be complicated aftermaths, and which leads us to questions on accountability, on compensation, on social livelihood restoration, which are very, very complex issues when it comes down to ground realities. So, bringing this conversation down to the One Belt, One Road, 65 countries are going to come into play with this initiative, which extends from Kunming all the way to Chicago. And within these 65 countries, you have different landscapes, different tapestries of geopolitical dynamics, you have coastal areas. So we're really wondering how to sort of absorb the scale of infrastructure. Now, obviously, from an Asian civil society point of view, environmentally protected areas will be our priority. And the most fragile and vulnerable communities like livelihood groups, forest groups, fisher folk, and agriculture sector folks who are working on the ground, they will be most impacted. Which leads us to the accountability of a large-scale infrastructure project, which has multiple players in development finance. So I don't want to take too much time, and there will probably be questions and answers later on, but I'll probably bring this down to this one statement that if you have a co-finance project which has the ADB, the AIIB, and the World Bank involved, and the project ends up becoming a PPP, who's going to hold it accountable? Whose accountability mechanism will be in play? And these are very, very deep questions if you look at the text of the safeguard policy within the ADB itself, because private sector, once again, will just self-report. And from a community point of view, that is probably going to be the biggest risk that we will face in the future.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and for keeping to time. I warned everyone that I would be quite strict, so thank you, but we also want to do this so we have a chance to have a discussion with everyone. So then could I ask, sorry, who's next? Me, to go next on climate financing and infrastructure.
Good morning, everybody. Just a few thoughts on our concerns about how money is being raised for infrastructure that's supposed to address the climate crisis, infrastructure that's supposed to be address environmentally sustainable growth. So this concern has been several years back. We've already raised this, and it seems that this trend is continuing as the ADB and other international financial institutions manifest this commitment to catalyze private finance for these types of infrastructure. We viewed with concern, for example, the involvement of the bank in capacity building for payment for ecological services, really bringing the environment and climate change into the market, and also showing potential profits of market creation approaches in natural resources management, and developing a new generation of financial instruments that gives prices to environmental goods, enables risk sharing between governments and investors, and makes new technology available and affordable. So in the last few years, we noted ADB's issuance of clean energy bonds and water bonds, selling at a worth of 232.2 million and 640 million respectively. Also recently, it was announced a credit enhancement for a subsidiary of a major coal-producing firm in the Philippines. This comes in the form of a local currency bond equivalent to around $230 million on top of a direct ADB loan of about $37 million. So our concern stems, first of all, from the absence of clear binding standards on what green bonds are, just as an example of the many instruments out there. This means that there is no certainty that the funds raised will not be used for infrastructure projects that are harmful to the environment or for activities that will only reinforce the very causes of the climate, food, and energy crisis. So take hydropower, for instance. It is being promoted as a viable source of clean and renewable energy. But dam reservoirs are a globally significant source of one of the most potent gases, methane. Some studies have estimated that they account for almost a quarter of all human-caused methane emissions, and these 104 million tons of methane are responsible for at least 4% of all human-caused global warming. So other financial institutions have also issued similar instruments, such as the World Bank and the European Investment Bank's Climate Awareness Bonds, the World Bank's issuance also of a green bond that went into projects that later on were found that they failed to take into account potential disasters, or that projects like waste incineration promoted as a cheap way for developing countries not to dispose of the waste, but really producing GHG emissions, which may be small compared to other sectors such as energy and agriculture, but if you consider the aggregate of materials cast off from extraction, production, consumption, and disposal, burning waste is one of the most carbon-intense sources of energy and can double the carbon dioxide emissions per unit of electricity of coal and oil-fired power plants. So instruments like these have also proven quite untouchable in terms of allowing public scrutiny and even more so accountability. So these kinds of erode the safeguards that the ADB itself is trying to promote. No? More fundamentally, we express our great alarm at the way the environment is aggressively being opened as a frontier of investment and speculation, or the manner in which the earth in crisis is being offered as a site of profit-making for private finance. As already shown from the pursuit of this direction by international financial institutions, and the ADB included, the adverse impacts on people, particularly impoverished, rural, indigenous communities, and the environmental resources to which they are inextricably linked have been tremendous and profound. The threat is very, very real that financializing local ecologies can erode people's sovereignty over their environmental resources and tie them to financial debts that can force them into production for cash rather than their own sustenance and survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, May, for that perspective. That's a great addition. And then if I could ask Jan Willem to give your perspective on the topics.
Well, it's a very broad range. I would say, first of all, my name is Jan Willem van der Waldbaan, and I'm the alternate director in a constituency that consists of several countries, including Canada, the Nordics, Ireland, and the Netherlands, and I'm myself Dutch. And my perspective is therefore not only one of the ADB, but also I think of the Netherlands and how we look upon those issues. But in general, I'm quite aware of the concerns that I hear. But let me begin by saying that if the ADB is indeed about 70% of its business is in infrastructure, and that's I think a very wide range of actual activities. I mean, if we focus on the really big ticket issues that you described today, One Belt, One Road, etc. That's only a part of the business. I think we have a very broad range, including rural infrastructure. Often, I think it is a big priority of the clients that we have, the countries. Even though I must say, sometimes if you go to the recipient countries, you discuss those issues, the first thing you hear actually often is that they want the ADB to be focusing on that, what they're good at, which is basically the infrastructure. And that doesn't mean because we have a broad range of sectors, we're also in education, we're in health, we're in public management, governance, a broad set of issues, policy dialogue with countries. And we cover all that normally in country partnership strategies that we will try to determine the priorities in individual countries. And I think one of the important issues is I think that if you go into infrastructure, you should do that indeed with a broad vision and not only focus on the roads that you're constructing, if it is a road, but look at the entire development framework and connect with other fields of development in the country and see whether what you're doing indeed connects well to the other priorities. And we have, as you know, the priorities of the bank are inclusive growth, sustainable growth, and regional cooperation and integration as the three main strands. So whatever we'll do, we try to focus and to fit it within that framework, basically. I think it is important as well that, of course, the safeguards are crucial. I do believe that even if we co-finance, our own safeguards will be for our own part in financing will be guiding, and we take them as seriously. I would say we do business with the private sector as when we do business with the public sector, and we hold them accountable to those issues. I know there are always trade-offs, and it's true that I'm aware of what the issues that you've been raising, even if you're in for example, in renewable energy. Certain projects in renewable energy can have very negative impacts in terms of the indigenous people, the impact on indigenous people, the impact on biodiversity. All these issues will be and are taken into account. And to the extent that they're not, if you feel they're not well taken into account, it's important for us to understand that, to learn from it, and to go to improve the performance in that issue. But I think on the whole, and that's a bit of a, I think, I don't use this as an excuse, but it's true that many of those projects, whether you want it or not, will take place. And it is an issue of, we believe, at least, we don't get into a project we don't believe it's good in itself. But I also sincerely believe that having a bank like the ADB on board will improve the quality of the projects from those perspectives. On the other hand, I think the bank has to improve certain things. For example, it's true that I believe, or we believe at least in our constituency, that it's necessary to if you say that a project has an impact on reducing poverty in a certain region, and some projects in infrastructure really have that impact, whether you believe it or not, then you also have to have it's not enough to state that, you actually have to measure whether that has that impact. And I think that's an important issue. You have to be able to have, I don't think you can do a survey for each project, but at least you have to be able to have a clear line of reasoning between your input and the output and the outcome of the project. And we have one of the most elaborate results framework in the bank. I think to the extent possible, it needs to be improved even further. We are now entering our new strategic discussions, as you may know, Strategy 2030. I think these are also the issues that we've raised, how to measure our impact on inclusive growth, to sharpen and target that instrument in a better way, not to say that all projects have a positive impact on inclusive growth, but beware what really has that impact and what not. And to improve and have a really well-targeted policy in that field. So let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Jan Willem, you did actually manage to cover all the topics across which are broad, but they're all interconnected. So I appreciate that. So we'll now take 10 minutes of comments and questions, and then we'll continue with the next round of speakers. And if I could ask you, please to introduce yourself and keep your comments and questions brief. There are also a few seats here at the front, so if people who are standing would like to take the opportunity to come and sit down, there are still a few seats. So on the topics we've heard of the type of infrastructure, the demand, and also in terms of climate financing and challenges around that. Are there any comments and questions to this point? Ask Steph Fried to please her contribution.
Good morning. Let's see if I can wake people up a little bit. I think what we're looking at here is the increased availability of infrastructure finance. And this is in the context, of course, of the launch of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And in that context, what we seem to be seeing is the World Bank, the IFC, the ADB sort of rushing even more to expand their efforts in the infrastructure scene. And as we know, of course, infrastructure is vital for development. One of the things that we see, however, is that there is an increasing use of what are called financial intermediaries for the delivery of infrastructure products. And so instead of funding, building a road directly, you fund an intermediary body, a bank or a private equity fund, which then funds these separate projects. And this is a bit difficult because they're rather opaque structures and difficult to follow. At the same time as we see this increased availability of infrastructure finance, we see decreasing civil society space throughout the region. And this does include changes in regional and laws throughout the region, including relatively recent introduction of new laws on NGOs in Indonesia, Cambodia, in China, and in other places. And we see sort of what appears to be an increase in extrajudicial measures against members of civil society who do speak up about issues of corruption or about even environmental destruction or indigenous issues. Again, infrastructure is vital for development. There's no argument there. Large-scale infrastructure projects, however, if developed without careful attention to impacts on the environment and communities, which is what we've heard from our Dutch colleague here as quite important. If we don't have these safeguards well implemented, it can lead to widespread impoverishment and the permanent loss of livelihoods, violent conflicts, increased militarization, and human rights violations. Farmers can lose access to their land and water, and in the context of planetary limits, we can see the increased destruction of forests and biodiversity and coastal areas and river systems, including a significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And we also see from experience with communities in the path of large-scale infrastructure developments that there can be pernicious impacts specifically also on women. When women lose their farming and fishing livelihoods, the employment that's offered in construction and office jobs is almost exclusively limited to men, which then increases women's lack of access to finance, and it often drives women and young girls into sex work, which leads into other negative downward spirals that may not be able to be checked or ended. One of the big issues that we see on both sides, an issue in the investment community and an issue for communities that are on the receiving end of infrastructure projects, is the issue of land acquisition. That's in the investment parlance, it's land acquisition. On the community parlance, it's land rights and the right to maintain their lands. This is a flashpoint for conflict. And what we're seeing in sort of a banking and finance context is that there is more and more finance available for infrastructure, but it's still difficult to find bankable projects. And one of the big blocks to bankability is this issue of land. So as a brief overview, we see a significant increase in infrastructure finance. We see an increasing use of opaque financial intermediaries and the difficulty of applying the safeguards of institutions such as the ADB. Not solely the ADB, however, all of the institutions are struggling with this, the World Bank and the IFC as well. It's difficult to apply these safeguards to do proper consultation, to do proper information disclosure. And again, in the center of this is an issue of land. We also see the rise of co-finance, and we know that the Asian Infrastructure Bank is hoping to partner with the ADB, and it was specifically mentioned in various talks over the past few days that the hope is that the ADB's safeguard standards will then be used jointly by both institutions, which would be, we think, a positive learning experience, especially if they're implemented well. We are seeing, however, an increasingly sophisticated use of fake consultations using all sorts of social media and documentation and photography. And so we're hoping that real attention can be paid to to the caliber of what is a consultation. It's not simply enough to receive a paper that says there has been a consultation. You actually need to know, is it a fake consultation or a real one? And we're seeing a rise of the fake ones in the infrastructure and financial intermediary world. One of the things that has been quite difficult is the lack of public information. So on the sub-projects financed by financial intermediaries, the ADB safeguards have some very interesting and strong language about the fact that the Asian Development Bank has to approve what are called Category A or high impact sub-projects of a financial intermediary. But we don't know if that's really happening. And it would be wonderful if it could be fully operationalized, and if that could be used as a global example, because the other institutions are absolutely struggling with this. Some of the key issues, again, that we see with the financial intermediaries in infrastructure include, again, the lack of publicly available documentation for these high-risk projects, a lack of information prior to appraisal or prior to approval on these projects. No lists of projects in the pipeline. We don't see monitoring or evaluation reports made public. We don't see demonstration of compliance with the World Bank or ADB or FC standards, and public consultations really appear to be a missing link. And these include consultations where 161-page environmental assessment is delivered right before the day before consultation. In conclusion, I'll just point to a recently launched, this was launched yesterday by 12 Indonesian NGOs. There's an assessment of Indonesian financial intermediaries and guarantee funds, sort of specific examples, some of which involve the ADB, some of which involve other groups, and there are a few of these available here and are posted online. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So the issue of fake consultations and the issue of measurement as well, I think these are all very relevant. And Kate Geary will take us further on that path. Thanks.
Sure, I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Stephanie's mentioned. I just first want to say that it's good to be here in Germany, especially given Germany's role in the newest development bank on the block, the AIIB. So Germany is heading the constituency, the Eurozone constituency of the AIIB that forms 10% of this new bank. So we're really hoping that Germany will continue to be a champion for human rights and on issues like climate change in this new bank, and that will also draw on lessons learned from its participation in other MDBs. And that's what I'm going to talk about just briefly this morning, is some of the lessons learned from other banks on infrastructure. Of course, I can't in 5 minutes cover all the lessons that we've ever learned from MDB infrastructure financing. So I want to focus down on two things. One is to reiterate some of the points that Stephanie has mentioned of the risks of financial intermediary lending. And second, I want to do a very, very quick look at the first project that AIIB has announced it will co-finance with the ADB in Pakistan, and some of the risks of that. The reason I want to focus on financial intermediary lending is twofold, really. It's really become the dominant model of development finance. 78% of IFC's lending is now through financial intermediaries. Over 40% of the European Investment Bank's overseas lending is now through financial intermediaries. It's a preferred method of infrastructure financing, as Stephanie mentioned, and it will feature strongly in the AIIB's financing for infrastructure. And the second reason for focusing on FIs is that Oxfam's got deep experience of working with communities all around the world, in Cambodia, Uganda, Guatemala, Honduras, elsewhere, directly with communities affected by projects financed through financial intermediaries who've endured displacement and human rights abuses and impoverishment. So on the first, with the Bank Information Centre, Oxfam's prepared a case study and lessons learned document using an IFC investment in the India Infrastructure Fund in India, and there are copies of this available in the room. I'll give one to you in a minute. This case is important because it was the very first time that communities brought a complaint to the IFC's watchdog, the CAO, on a financial intermediary project. And the CAO reported in January this year on its findings. they found that communities had suffered severe environmental and social harms due to failures in the IFC's due diligence and upholding of its own standards. Basically, by lending through a third party, what had happened was the IFC had essentially lost control over the project that it had supported. And the consequences for communities were absolutely devastating. There was forced displacement of indigenous people, there were arrests and intimidation, human rights abuses, pollution of vital water resources for local communities. And the lessons from this case study are specific to IFC, but the lessons learned are relevant for all the MDBs. So I'm really encouraged to hear that our ADB friends want to learn lessons about implementation. The lessons learned very briefly from this case are that it's desperately important to improve transparency, that documents are made available to stakeholders prior to project approval, and that sub-projects financed through financial intermediaries, the information on them is made publicly available, that there should be genuine application of free, prior and informed consent, there should be improved monitoring and supervision and risk management, and that commitments to avoid resettlement in the first place should be taken seriously. And these recommendations are intended to prevent harm in MDB projects, but we also need to take the discussion a step further. So ADB's premise is that infrastructure will lead to inclusive growth, but it's not clear how that inclusiveness is measured. My colleague Jessica has recently done some work in Vietnam looking at the contribution of ADB's agriculture projects to livelihood improvements at household and individual level, and it's really at that level that you can see the real impact on people at the household and individual level. And our research has shown that very often that sort of baseline information does not exist or is very, very sketchy. And that brings me on, as I've only got a couple of minutes left, I have to skip like mad, to some concerns around the first AIIB project that's been announced this weekend. So the AIIB will be jointly financing a highway project in Pakistan that the ADB has already started. And I've not been to Pakistan, I've not talked to the affected communities. All I've done is, over my weekend, read a 200-page resettlement action plan for the project, and that's already raised some alarm bells. A very quick scan shows some really deep and disturbing problems with the quality of the assessment of the impacts on poor and vulnerable communities. And one example is gender impacts, which, as you can imagine, in Pakistan is a really important issue. The ADB's got some great gender-sensitive policies, and the Resettlement Action Plan echoes these. It says the consultation process was gender-inclusive, with key informant interviews, gender-sensitive focus groups, and information dissemination campaigns. But the devil's in the detail, right? Despite this lovely politically correct language, in practice, of the 34 villages that will be affected by this massive highway construction with a lot of land acquisition, in only 13 of those villages did they actually manage to talk to women. So the consultants didn't manage to talk to a single woman in 21 of the villages. None. So overall, of the 609 people that were consulted, only 88 were women. So the Resettlement Action Plan's own figures show that 12,000 women will be affected to 11,000 women. But never mind, maybe the data that they got from talking to these women was of high quality and enough to extrapolate from. But on the contrary, I need to read you this quote from the Resettlement Action Plan. It says, the income analysis do not include women population interviewed during the sample survey, as they're not involved in income generating activity, and their role is mainly limited to household work. So elsewhere in the resettlement plan, it describes women working in the fields, and as only 15% of the houses along the route have got running water, I imagine women are collecting and fetching water to contribute to their households, and yet their contribution is counted as zero. If women contribute nothing, then why on earth should they be compensated for the losses they suffer? I could carry on, there are so many examples, but for reasons of time, I'm just going to limit my last point to this. that the biggest lesson of all from communities' experiences of how infrastructure impacts their lives is that fine words mean nothing. All the best policies in the world are just meaningless unless they're implemented. And this is how banks, old banks, new banks, are going to be judged by civil societies and communities, not by the policies that they have and the commitments they make, but whether they deliver for the poorest and most vulnerable, and whether they protect them from harm. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we've seen quite tellingly already the challenges of applying policies and what that looks like on the ground. So we'll continue on that, but before we go to a broader discussion, Knut will talk to us about harmonization of safeguard policies.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Well, after Kate's concluding sentences, it's hard to add something up because it was so impressive. Anyway, I try now to give you a broader picture how civil society sees a pattern in what's called harmonization of standards. All in all, it's a good idea to harmonize standards, of course, because it makes the life of the recipient and especially the implementer much easier when several donors come in, not to abide to 10 standards, but to one harmonized thing. The problem is that this, as we see it, is actually ending in a race to the bottom. And so maybe the nice sentence that's carved into stone in the World Bank, we have a dream of a world without poverty, becomes a nightmare for the affected people. This all, from my perspective, I work in this area now for 13 years, started a bit when the IFC, so the private sector arm of the World Bank, renovated their safeguards and renamed it to performance standards. There they introduced a lot of discretion for themselves. They introduced a high reliance on borrowers, not only borrowers themselves doing all the assessments, but also they reported on their own results, and so they are really highly reliant on the borrowers themselves. The internal evaluation group of the World Bank, when they assessed the overall safeguard systems within the World Bank group, they urged the World Bank not to follow that lead because the high reliance on self-reporting led to lack of knowledge and also no real accountability. Well, now we have the World Bank Safeguard Review, and they followed the lead despite the IG, the only evaluation department telling them otherwise. And the World Bank is telling, well, implementation comes first, so we tried a lot of front-loading, a lot of big studies, and this all ended in nothing because the implementation was the problem. So now we skip a lot of the studies we done before and just concentrate on implementation. And this is, to our perspective, throwing out the child with the bathwater, because you need strong baseline studies, just as Kate mentioned and other colleagues here mentioned. When you're doing resettlement, you need baseline. You need to know who's going to be affected, how they're going to be affected, and all of this. And you can't do this by a deferred appraisal. So first of all, approve the general plan and then just look what happens through implementation. The World Bank safeguard, the new draft, for example, they have very vague language. They open up critical habitats for offsetting, and they also rely heavily on the borrowers and on the country systems. And of course, country systems as such is a nice idea, like harmonization. We want the recipient countries to have better standards, to have very good legal systems, but now we're child of very seasoned World Bank experts that were hired, and so that's no wonder that the AIIB goes in the same direction as the World Bank is going. The overall pattern that we see is there is nice language. If you're not like many of my colleagues in this area for a couple of years, at least 5, 6, 7 years, you're easily diverted by the aspirational language that comes in the first chapters, because there are all the nice buzzwords. There's even reference to the SDGs and things like these. But when it really comes to the details, then you see that language is opening up almost everything. It's if financially viable, if there's no viable economic alternative. So one loophole after the other. And this is something that makes it almost impossible for all the accountability mechanisms to really do something about it. And the ADB seems to follow this path. At least that's what I interpret from what Nassim Ahmad said on Monday, because he said it's implementation first, second, and third, and we have to harmonize with the others. And I really urge the ADB to stick to the standards they have. It was a hard battle to get these, and they're in comparison to other banks, they are rather okay, and now it's about implementation, but don't forget the contents. Just to wrap up, like my colleague said, the financial intermediary problem is looming all over the place, and you see it in the private sector. If you're outside sourcing your chain of production, you get a lot of problems. Rana Plaza is one of the examples. And if you outsource finances to the FIs, you get the same problems in the same place.
Very much. Lord, again, the telling, the challenging question: how do we get from good policies to implementation, and do we need to keep these upfront policies, or are there other ways? And what way are MDBs going to go? There is hands up already. So shall we? I was going to ask the speakers to put just their thoughts on how inclusive growth can be possible. So maybe we'll do that briefly, and then we'll come back to the audience. So we've seen the challenges, and we've discussed that on the panel. So I'd like to ask us all to think about, how do we think infrastructure can actually be inclusive? What would it take for that to be the case? And is it even possible? So if anyone on the panel would like to respond to that briefly, please do so.
I don't mind, as I already mentioned, I think. Just briefly, again, if we talk about infrastructure, we talk about a wide range of activities actually, and it really is, discussion today focuses on a few very large projects actually. So the first issue here is basically infrastructure is very diverse, and it is actually crucial for inclusivity in countries. Inclusiveness, it's really is the, if you go to any country and you see that the farmers can't bring their products to the markets, they don't have access to the normal facilities, water, electricity, others have, I think. So therefore, it is crucial. And then the other issue is often sequencing, because then the answer that you hear is often yes, but we first need to have the main road, otherwise you don't get to the what uses a district road if you don't have any access to the ports. So that's, to some extent that's true, but you have to plan, and arguably it's no excuse only to be focusing on the main. The bigger tickets issue, but as a bank, we also have to deliver on the district and rural infrastructure. I think we really try to. It's often not very easy, because you also have to realize that it's the demand. I mean, we have to be asked to do something. We can't impose. We're a bank. We're not like a donor that can simply say, okay, we have grants, and ultimately the money has to be repaid. So we have to respect the priorities of we have a policy dialogue. But there are limits to what we can impose on a country in terms of the demand. So you have to take into account there are certain limits. But as far as I know, at least, and as far as I've seen myself, I think serious efforts are being made to convince countries that it's not only about big ticket issues. And then I think basically what we've been discussing, I think the issue of safeguards and the strict implementation of those safeguards. I agree entirely that we have to be. It's not enough. It's not a tick the box exercise. You have to look to the quality of the due diligence process. And I think often, it's impossible for us all to read every resettlement action plan, the level of detail that you've done. But I think it would be useful for us to get a signal if you believe there's something which is not right.
Thank you. Yeah, Kay, would you like to respond? And then just briefly.
I think for infrastructure to be inclusive, you need to ask it's infrastructure for whom and for what. And if we take the energy investments of the World Bank, for example, in a recent survey, I think it was found that only 1.5% of the energy projects the World Bank was backing actually improved energy access for the poorest. If we're talking about energy access for poor people, that's a completely different type of infrastructure than the mega dams or the mega compounds that we see that serve urban elites and usually industry, mining. So I think we have to really look at who is the energy for, who is the infrastructure for, and what purpose is it serving. And if we can answer those questions, that it's genuinely for the poorest, genuinely for the most vulnerable, for women, then maybe we'll get more inclusive.
Thank you. René, you would like to respond to that question?
Well, the question actually goes down to the borrower and the manifestation of the development project itself. Ideally, the borrower's sphere of operation has a larger geopolitical question surrounding it. It depends on who the borrower is, who the next door neighbor is, what are the geopolitical, economic, military tensions around the region, and that plays a key role into the manifestation of a project. And if you go a sphere beyond it, you come to the place of development finance. And development finance is offering us credit from the AIIB, from the ADB or the World Bank. And from the credit line down to the borrower, to accepting the loan and getting the project on the ground, ideally should be driven by the national development agenda. Now, we are trusting the national development agenda to have the inclusive growth issue at the center of it. Now our question is the borrower free to make that rightful choice of which development project will manifest for that agenda to be fulfilled? I can just point towards FDC and May here and just talk about the debt in Asia as one factor which influences what kind of projects get manifested. And I'll just keep it there for the floor to think about.
Thank you. Knut, also?
Yeah, maybe from a bit different perspective. I'm not a practitioner in Asia, but I can just, as a member of an advocacy NGO, I have a perspective working together with affected communities. And so what I see is inclusion of the people on the ground is paramount. And it starts with the country assistance strategies, or how these things are named, so that this is already an inclusive process and nothing that just happens in, let's say, Jakarta and Manila in the exchange of the offices of the ministry and the ADB. And also, one thing that also belongs to infrastructure is the immaterial infrastructure of finance. And I guess it's the wrong way to pave inroads for big banks and finance, but Germany in the 19th century flourished because we had a system of municipal banks and of cooperative bank. I guess in the Netherlands it was almost the same. And giving venture capital and knowledge and support to establish this kind of financial system also empowers people in the regions, in the grounds.
Great, thank you, Knut, for that answer. Steph and May, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, also in connection with what Ryan has mentioned, it's very clear in climate justice movements that any responses to the climate crisis must not add additional burdens to the South. So it cannot be through loans, no, that people will end up paying. And if we also look at the kind of lending that's going very strongly into coal, so it's actually very ironic that on one hand ADB has an RE, renewable energy thrust, but at the same time it's continuing with funding fossil fuels. No? So one of the big headlines on the opening day was the signing of a memorandum of cooperation between AIIB and ADB, and it was mentioned also that for those investments in state-of-the-art coal-fired power plants, they will be encouraged to go into emissions trading. So we know, perhaps we know very well what's that about, no? And we have very strong ethical and moral questions about carbon offset. So it's a really red flag now that came up.
Yeah, that's definitely something to bear in mind. Thanks.
I think the core basis of inclusivity is transparency and consultation. And sort of following up on the theme raised by Kate, the devil is in the details. So there is this tension. You know, how does the ADB review these sorts of measures? I mean, Kate in a weekend found massive dilutions. Why isn't this picked up earlier? Is this a capacity issue? Surely with the amount of finance currently being aimed at infrastructure, there must be sufficient finance to allow proper oversight and review. With financial intermediaries, there's a massive dependence on self-reporting. So this is self-reporting by a non-bank entity, by a private equity fund, which does not have expertise, for example, in doing the household assessments that Kate was talking about. There is a true emphasis on mega infrastructure. We are seeing mega, no matter what's being talked about, we still are seeing these large projects. Just to bring you back to 12 Indonesian groups documented in this document. There are letters from the ministries of finance. There's a huge orchestrated use of consultants sending letters from finance ministries, not the ministries themselves sending letters, but the consultants sending them, then taking pictures of these people. And there's a manufacturing of the appearance of consultation. And the devil is in the details. So I really urge people to get familiar with some of these details so that you recognize these patterns when you see them. And really, this is the bank's job. I mean, the bank's job is to be this leader. You have these good safeguards, and we know that offices such as your office at HEB has been a strong voice for these safeguards and their implementation. So it's really an institutional question. How is it resourced, but with an aim at transparency and consultation? It's also in the context of rule of law. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. So, yeah, still a big way to go, and we will also ask now the audience to give their contributions. Lots of hands, so maybe we'll take 3 first, and then go through that. Please introduce yourself and keep the questions or comments brief. We'll start with Peter. Thanks. Is there a mic anywhere? Oh, the mics, I guess, are okay.
Good morning. My name is Petr Holobel. I'm with Bankwatch Network. Last year, we started to follow one of the projects of the ADB together with European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and European Investment Bank called NENSCRA. This is a dam in Georgia, 280 megawatts. I guess this is not a mega project, it's only 1 billion euro. I think it's what is quite important to note what was the asked question by the query. Infrastructure for who? This project is designed for the export electricity to Turkey. Fair enough. Now the local people is asking, what will be our stake in it? They already passed through the experience when another dam was built 30 years ago. There was a promise of development, there was a promise of electricity access, and there was promise of the free electricity. Of all of this, only the last one was fulfilled. Electricity is indeed for free. Nevertheless, you can't use it, because the frequency of electricity in the villages is going up and down, so they are afraid to plug their TVs, appliances, computers. School reported that 9 of their 10 computers was damaged because of the frequency fluctuation. So they have electricity for free, not much of use. There are 400 families who will be affected by this project. All of them are entrepreneurs. They are working on the forestry, processing the wood materials, agriculture. Probably their development would be better served if this distribution network of the electricity is properly maintained. Their development will be much better served if the road to the villages is properly repaired, so you don't spend 2 hours riding 4 kilometers road. That's one aspect of it. I think a second aspect of it is I've been there nearly a year ago, 9 months ago, when we learned that the banks are planning to invest into this project. We put together a report looking to the deficiencies of the consultations and deficiencies of the documentation. There was others who did the same. We sent it to the banks, we sent it to the ADB, we sent it to the EBRD, we sent it to the AIIB. There was no response on this. Yesterday we had a meeting with the ADB staff. They said, yes, our consultants are aware of it, we're looking into this issue. Well, if they are looking into this issue, then what would not happen is that a week ago, people in the villages take the things to their hands and they block start of the construction. Because they were absolutely unsatisfied with the level of the consultation, discussion, and the listening to their demands. These issues were not addressed. Bank knew it in advance. The bank is still not in the project, it's still not approved. But it's very clear that the bank is lacking a capacity of the working with the communities, addressing their concerns, working with the project companies who are taking the money and just making sure that they fulfill the standards that bank does have. And I think this is absolutely essential.
Thank you, Peter. So that was another example of the challenge of actually, implementing projects and the due diligence that needs to happen and doesn't seem to be happening. So there was another question here from Chad, and then there was someone else.
Chad Thompson, Bank Information Center, and I'm afraid it's a follow-up from Stephanie and Kate and what Peter just said. We focus primarily on the World Bank and looking at how it implements things. And what we've learned recently, because they're talking about the implementation of the new proposed draft safeguards, is that they've only discovered now, of course, that they don't know how much or who is doing the safeguards they currently have. And they're hoping in the new budget series to be able to monitor that and ascribe that what the costs are. So they haven't had any notion at this point about what the costs are of doing it and what they actually need to do it. They're now trying to hire 12 new people to bring them up to speed on what they've decided that they weren't able to do before. Now, it could easily be that the ADB is in a much better place than that, and you've got it under control. Although I would argue from what Kate's reading of the Pakistan project, that it's not really acceptable for a bank to say, we can't read all of the project documentation. Somehow, that is the bank's responsibility in compliance with the policies, especially at a time when, I would argue, that closing space for civil society and the interlocutors you have with the Oxfams and the others in these countries is the space for them to work is decreased. So there's a whole bunch of civil society here in the room that are in fact unpaid consultants to the banks to try to bring their attention to the things that we think that we understand from the communities that are problems. At the same time, oftentimes governments are closing down that stuff.
Lowering the standards or making it more flexible. So I think from many angles, I think we are on your side in that struggle to keep the standards as high as they can be. Nevertheless, I think I also hear the voices that it's not so much, not only about the actual formal formalities, the formal standards, the formal procedures on paper, but it's actually about the quality of the implementation process, and that is, and therefore also the costs that the bank has to make to monitor that. Now, I hear your voice. I can't at this point say anything about it, but it's certainly an issue which deserves attention. And again, I think even though you're right, I mean, it's not your responsibility to monitor our safeguards. But I think it is for us in the board. It's important to get the signals when you believe something hasn't been done thoroughly enough. On the other hand, I have to admit, probably, and there are always limits. I mean, there are always limits to what you can do. Basically, these are very intricate, very complicated, very detailed issues. These are individual human beings that are actually being affected, and the extent to which a bank can actually understand the issue of 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 individuals is sometimes very difficult. So it's not something which is I don't use that as an excuse, because it's like that everywhere. It's also with governments. Governments, if they imply policy, they do not understand to the extreme detail what the impacts are. So I'm not trying to play it down, but it's there. I think it's understandable that sometimes some issues get not picked up. And I think I'm very grateful if those signals come to us for you.
Thanks very much, Jan. Gentleman there, thank you for waiting.
Thank you very much. I am Deputy Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute. We are based in Tokyo with the Asian Development Bank located in Manila, Philippines. So my question is about urbanization and urbanization infrastructure in developing Asia. According to ADB and Asian Development Bank Institute's research, 67% of people in Asia will live in cities by 2050. This would lead to tremendous urbanization and massive expansion in urban infrastructure. So, however, developing countries can't simply follow the carbon-intensive path taken by industrialized countries. So, therefore, international organizations, leading think tanks, and civil societies should monitor and guard the ecological red line. So, it would be great if you can share your experiences and achievements and recent initiatives taken by your organization supporting the environment and the sustainable development in urbanization, the issue of urbanization and urban infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, urbanization is definitely an emerging issue. If anyone wants to speak from the panel, I think one issue that we have looked at is in the context of land acquisition as well in urban centers, and what that means. Would anyone else like to contribute? Ryan?
Well, we're a civil society network which is monitoring the ADB, so we don't really have a program which directly looks at environmental restoration or that kind of a program. But most of our groups are environmental groups and water groups. So from that perspective, what we are thinking is really to look at the local level and really enhance the relationship between the local group and the forest-dependent livelihood or the agrarian-dependent livelihood, and see which particular environmentally protected areas need to be conserved in order to offset the rampant infrastructure development and emissions which are to follow. So I think it goes both ways in terms of how civil society is going to respond, and various groups in civil society will all have to play their own part. Us as an advocacy group, we will carry on the message to build resistance on the ground.
Thank you, Ryan. Anyone else on the panel want to respond to that?
Yes, I think in the sense that I think a number of the organizations that are sitting here today have been engaged in work on safeguards. And so one of the key things for the development of urban infrastructure to make it inclusive is, again, the principles of consultation, participation, information disclosure. So all of those very vitally important safeguards are at the core of being able to do this. And that includes the way that environmental impact assessments are done. So it includes cumulative impacts, it includes climate impacts, and it definitely includes the ability of local civil society groups in urban areas to make their voices heard and to be engaged in these discussions with the governments. And so while many of our examples were drawn from a rural area, the same principles apply in terms of the safeguards and openness and transparency.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. So we've got two hands.
My name is Mama.
Can you come to the first one? Sorry.
I am Maha Kubabubia. I am a recently retired country director of Plan International, and I'm working with Chris, documenting what's happening here. And so I'm listening intently. So just like UK, I have all kinds of stories about, that's how we look at things, what's happening on the ground. But I also give the benefit of the doubt to those other people working, for example, in the bank. So I would like to think that I heard concern about intermediary funding institutions. But I like to give the benefit of the doubt that there are bright people who thought about why we have to go through. I'm not a banker, so I do not know the reason, but I'd like to know, because there might have been benefits that they saw in having intermediary banks. Intermediary funding institution. If it is such a bad idea, what's the option? What is it that we can do? Because sometimes in our work, we look at, yes, the impact, and we try to solve something, but that's not necessarily the issue, or that's not necessarily the problem. But I see exactly what you see, and 25 years in plan, I saw all kinds of problems of implementing not only infra, but many kinds of projects. So I'd like to know from Jan and the bankers, what's the benefit that had been seen by the bank in having intermediary funding institutions? Thank you.
To be honest, I think first of all, we do have a rather big problem for intermediaries, and there are many different type of projects actually that we do with the financial intermediaries. But clearly, the goal is to be able to do smaller things. I mean, we are a bank. I think every year we have a volume of around up to or higher than 15 billion. Basically, we have the actual professionals in the bank are around thousands. You have to reach out to a variety of countries. We have at this point relatively small core teams in the resident missions. It is impossible to reach out to SMEs in these countries if we wouldn't do it through financial intermediaries. So it is clear that this is the only way to go about it. The question is whether then the safeguards or the mechanism that we have to make sure that our intermediaries comply with our own standards are good enough or not. There are clearly there will be mistakes in that process. Even if you have the most thorough process, but the question whether it's good enough, the way we deal with it, that's open for discussion, I guess. You have to understand, of course, that yes, if asking a financial intermediary to do, for example, to do impact surveys after certain operations, that would probably make the cost of the operation for many of them, and to be able to have affordable operations could be very difficult. There are limits to because these are very, very costly type of operations. So you have to be realistic, and we have to see what is practical, but also if it's not good enough, and if they're clear, if you can clearly point at certain issues where big mistakes are being made, then we have to hold those institutions accountable and find ways to better monitor.
Thank you, Jan. Did you want to respond briefly, Kate? Or
just very, very quickly respond, if that's okay. Your words are extremely welcome, and we agree that it's not an issue that all financial intermediary lending per se is wrong. That's not what any of us are saying. And indeed, building up the capacity for SME lending is a worthwhile thing, and lending through financial intermediaries is a way of doing that. What we're saying is that the really big, high risk and substantive risk stuff, where you're lending to some of the biggest commercial banks that then on lend to projects like Tata Mundra, Adani in India, the Narmada dams even, the biggest dams on the Mekong, in those types of very high risk, very socially costly projects, we're not seeing the strong application of the bank standards. But certainly SME finance, we have no problem with that.
Thank you, Kate. Any more questions or comments from the floor?
Good morning. My name is Hemant. I think this session is much more beyond the social and environmental safeguards. What we see today that you have the tools like the environmental impact assessment, resettlement plans, etc. Then you monitor and you check whether there are environmental social safeguards. But we are beyond that level now. We have to think about the planetary safeguard is not only the environmental and social safeguards of one selected project. I have seen in the last couple of months that Canadian companies selling air in China and India, breathing air, you are selling. So that means we are crossing all these limits and we don't have simply the resources to meet some development the way we are thinking. So when we are thinking about a developed infrastructure driven growth model, so in that growth model you have to really understand whether we have the resources. I will share one example in Sri Lanka. There's one Chinese funded project in Sri Lanka which is going to have a Colombo port city, which is part of the Silk Road, China Silk Road. It's going to destroy the fishing grounds of more than 15,000 fishermen. And they're going to simply dredge 65 million cubic meters of sea sand. And I put a very, very safe cost, and I found 4.2 billion worth resources we are just dumping in this island. Where when you have the lands available, you don't really have to fill the ocean and create such a land. So this is called infrastructure projects. And this morning I thought, like, when I watched the television, I thought, like, there are no people in this world. All of them are consumers. Because we are looking from the point of view of the companies, and for the companies, for the people who are making products, we all are consumers. But in this world, we have the people who are self-sufficient, who are just not depending on somebody else, who grow their own food, who get their own water. But in this big infrastructure, we are destroying their territories. We are destroying their self-sufficient systems, livelihood. So I'm a bit worried about how I really understand we need the health, the schools, hospitals, etc. These are infrastructure that many of the people want. But in a world that we are crossing the planet limits when the world is not going to end all these oil. Is there any use of having big mega roads or 6-lane highways all across Asia and Europe and putting people this kind of burden? I'm really trying to understand what is this big mega development growth model that you are going to put billions of money into the destruction of our self-existence, our own existence in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Was that a question or a comment? Would anyone like to respond? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. You made a point, and I just want to come back to my talking points about harmonization. And this is, just what you said is the big challenge. Almost all countries of the world subscribe to the Sustainable Development Goals. Just last week, I guess it was last week, the Paris Accord was signed in a big ceremony. Almost all shareholders of all multilateral development banks signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to all the Economic and Social Rights Convention, you name it. And when you look at the safeguard systems of the bank, you see also a pattern that this is not reflected in any way in the safeguard systems. At the World Bank, there's a strong refusal to even mention safeguards. Human rights. Yeah. It has been a busy week. And this pattern goes on and on. So, and I guess it's the role of the people, and it's the role of civil society, and hopefully also of parliaments and others to remind those banks that the member states have an obligation, and this obligation has to be reflected in their actions in these banks, and the banks themselves, for that reason, have this obligation and just can't shy away of it and just go on and go for the biggest growth model that's possible. We're not there any longer. Of course, some regions there has to be growth, some regions the growth has to be limited, and even maybe there have to be degrowth models and several other models of economy. But there has to be a change of perception, a change of thinking.
Thank you. We had a question there.
Hello, thank you. I'm Peter Wolberding, and a doctoral candidate from Harvard University. I have a question mainly for the civil society folks here. I'm primarily interested in the increase in outward investment in development aid from non-traditional donors, such as China. I was wondering what the impact of this increase in development aid and investment was for civil society, since China and some of these other donors have a weaker civil society platform. What has been the impact on your organizations, and what strategies have you done to increase your influence on these assessments?
Thank you. That's a very good question, particularly because we actually had a Chinese civil society speaker who was going to speak, but he had to go back because of visa issues. So it's not always that easy. That was already one, and I think Ryan is probably well placed to respond to that.
Well, this has been a question which has been circulating around civil society circles, both in Asia and Europe and elsewhere in the world. Difficult. It's not easy. You don't want to... See, we're in a state where everything is happening for the first time. It's 49 years of ADB, and it's not even the first year of AIIB. It's the 6th month. So how does civil society respond to it? Requires us to sort of look at what we know how to do, gathering the experience on the World Bank, gathering the experience in the EBRD, ADB, etc., and then thinking, okay, the resident mission, the resident headquarters is in Beijing, what is the civil society space there? So with the Thursday law which just got passed, we realized, all right, the space is not very good, especially for international organizations to go there, unless the AIIB sends you out an invite. But at this point, the position is quite simple. It is to have a constructive dialogue with the AIIB, because we feel, from the context of the One Belt, One Road, there is going to be extreme social and environmental issues which need to be brought up in planning, in design, in accountability, in policies sectorally, and these discussions need to be had. I guess this particular session from civil society is nothing much more than a plea for AIIB to open those doors so that we can have those conversations meaningfully.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Was there someone there? Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very informative presentation from the panel. I'm from Japan International Cooperation Agency. I'm a bilateral development bank, and I'm glad not to hear my country's name in this presentation. But my question is related to the previous one regarding co-financing project, because not only multilateral development banks, but also Japan and JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, are keen to develop the kind of
co-finance project based on the need of development of infrastructure. But my question is, what's the very or unique challenges for implementation of safeguard for that kind of co-finance or bilateral institutions? So if you have any specific experience in the field, please share. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yep, Stephanie? Well, interestingly enough, the ADB itself has pretty strong requirements on co-financing, which mean that the ADB's own requirements need to be implemented in projects that the ADB is involved with. And so this is actually, it's actually quite good when implemented. We're not sure that it's really being implemented, and it would be wonderful if it were fully implemented. But from the ADB's viewpoint, in theory, these safeguards, which include, for example, giving a community a 120-day notice of a project that has a substantial impact on their lives or on their community, they would have 120 days prior to a board vote to comment on a draft environmental impact assessment.
It's twice as high.
Yes, exactly. It's twice as high as IFC, and it's a leading standard. So, for example, in the upcoming co-finance with the AIIB, it would be very important for that standard to be made clearly implemented. There are other standards. There are standards, as Kate pointed out, on gender that are quite high in the ADB. What's troubling, however, is in this first co-financing project that you looked at this weekend, from a weekend-long look. We're not seeing that, but that's what the hope is.
Yeah, again, implementation. So I think we'll take one more question and then we're going to have to come to a close. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Antje Kunst. I'm from TI Deutschland. I have a question which is as follows. Could you tell us from a civil society point of view and also from the ADB point of view how you could hold international intermediary financial intermediaries accountable in those high-risk projects, also large projects, when a violation of the safeguards occurs?
Thank you. I think that's a question we're all grappling with. Kate, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly personal question. It's a real problem and it stems from transparency. So, an example. In 90% of the IFC's financial intermediary lending, there is no information whatsoever about where that money ends up. So how on earth, when harms occur at the community level, can the community hold the FI or the bank that's lending into that accountable? And until there is this transparency, you can't get any of the other steps for accountability. So the way we've been doing it at Oxfam is buying extremely expensive subscriptions to commercial databases, banking databases, Thomson Reuters and Bloomberg, and through that tracking where the loan from IFC goes to a commercial bank, for example, and then tracking where that commercial bank is lending to. That information is not publicly available, it's only through paywall, but that's how we've been able to reveal these cases that then enable communities to take these cases back up to the accountability mechanisms, and it shouldn't be that way. Thanks.
Thanks. So that's the answer basically is it starts with transparency, I think. Before I close, I'll just give a chance to anyone on the panel to make any more comments.
I've got 2 quick points. I think the first one being what was addressed. This is a clear concern of the times. I remember in the civil society management meeting with the president, and that's something that we asked him, that if the lending moves towards private sector and FIs, what happens to the safeguards? Well, according to the SPS 2010, it applies across the board to all. Great, but there needs to be due diligent safeguard specialist, permanent staff, not consultant, on the ground for every FI project, making sure social and environmental restoration takes place. Now that machinery has not been thought out, it hasn't been planned out. The due diligence of that decision-making chain has not been set up. Even for the existing safeguards for sovereign loans, if you ask around, the Sustainable Development Climate Change Department, which is the custodian, and all the links in the chain, there is no chain of command for delivering safeguards. There's 108 very special safeguard specialists, but I don't know where they're special, so if you ask me.
Okay, thank you. And any other closing comments from the panel? Stephanie, briefly?
Just a response to the question about holding, how does one hold the financial intermediaries accountable? The groups that were trying to unpack the Indonesian financial intermediaries did not have access to an extensive database. But what they did instead was to troll through the newspaper, just general newspaper reports, and they also generated a large amount of pressure at the national level and an international level by speaking with the staff of the bank, the executive directors of World Bank and other financial institutions, and generating enough pressure so that finally some of the names of the projects that had already been financed came out. But for the projects in the pipeline, it's completely opaque. What I would suggest, since this is working with private sector, normally things are put into a contract. So it would be a very, very simple matter for the ADB to negotiate, as is increasingly beginning to slightly happen at the IFC as a result of public pressure, to negotiate the contents of the contract. If you're doing a contract with a financial intermediary, then if you want the ADB's logo, brand name, and funding or guarantee, then you need to have in that contract requirements for disclosure of all of the important documents, including the monitoring documents, including the draft environmental assessments, consultation requirements, and all the safeguard requirements. We don't know whether those are in the contracts. We suspect not, but it's a very simple measure to take. And it would make the work of the executive directors quite easy in the sense that it would be transparent. By law, they'd have to release this, so no one would have to really be hunting.
Thank you. I do want to close us on time because people are needing to leave. I think this was a great session. I think we've only sort of touched and opened on a lot of big challenges. And what comes out also is that what is needed is resourcing of due diligence and resourcing of implementation. And that may mean that you put more financing into one project, but you do it well. That is costly, but the outcomes may actually be better. And in the context of the strategy 2030 that the ADB is developing, hopefully that is something that can be taken up. And I think the ADB could be a real leader in this area as it currently is with the safeguards and take it one step forward. And I think we would all be able to and happy to support that and see how that can best be done. So please give a round of applause to all of the speakers.